Well, all right. You guys seem to like this last week when I did it, so here we are back again for week 3 of NHL Power Rankings. It's actually the second week I'm doing it, but we're 3 weeks into the season, so I'm going with week 3. And again, this is just the top 10. I'm not doing the full 32 like the Hockey Guy or some other channels. I just don't have the time for it, and it allows to go a little bit more in depth with some of the teams. Or I suppose at the very least, try to keep this video a little bit on the shorter end. So in that vein then, let's go ahead and jump right into it, where once again I do have a couple of honorable mentions to get here before jumping into the top 10. First off, once again, the Carolina Hurricanes don't quite crack my top 10 this week, partially because they didn't have the hardest schedule, so it was going to be hard for them to get there, even though they have won now 2 in a row. But they also did have the 1 loss, so again, while I do expect them to be getting into the top 10 maybe as early as next week, and certainly as the season goes along, they're just not quite there yet. And then the second team I wanted to mention here is maybe not one that I'm necessarily expecting to see in this top 10 potentially at all this season, but if they continue the hot start that they've had to the season and collecting points at the rate they have been, they will definitely be finding their way into this top 10 sooner rather than later. And that would be the Montreal Canadiens, who have been collecting wins. A lot of them have been in shootout or overtime and not necessarily against the most difficult opponents, but wins are wins, and well, they're definitely something the team I cheer for has had a hard time figuring out how to get. So then as we start things off in the top 10, obviously in the 10th spot, I have dropping all the way from 4th last week, the Detroit Red Wings, who had a tough week, and really the only reason they're still here in the top 10 is because of that incredibly hot start they got off to. Obviously, this week started off with a game that a lot of Red Wings were probably still a bit sour about because of horrendous officiating both ways, but obviously Red Wings, having lost, are going to focus on the calls that went wrong for them, specifically Schwartz throwing the stick. But the week did start off with that 5-4 overtime loss to the Seattle Kraken, who, don't get me wrong, and maybe this is partially because it's the team I cheer for and I'm potentially thinking overly optimistically, but I do think the Kraken are a better team than their record suggests. Either way, it's a team that's gotten off to a pretty bad start to the season, and Detroit lost to them at home. Still, it could be a forgivable one had they not gone and lost back-to-back games by a score of 4-1 at home to Winnipeg, which, again, another team that's not gotten off to the best start, and then to Boston on the road, which that one's a little bit more forgivable. That Boston team is once again refusing to go quietly into the night with their core aging and whatnot. But even if you can kind of talk your way into forgiving the overtime loss to the Kraken because of the terrible officiating and the loss in Boston to one of the best teams in the league, it's still a week of 3 straight losses, an 0-2-1 record. And even though the Red Wings still do have the leading goal scorer in the NHL in DeBrincat with 9, and 2 of the NHL's leading point getters, plus having the 3rd best power play, a lot of that is due to the hot start to the season, and that just being a result of the rest of the league having to catch up. For the Red Wings then, this next week will be a telling one. They started off, probably today by the time you're watching this, in New York against the Islanders, and then come back home to face the Panthers and Bruins again. So if they can manage to win 2 of the 3 of those, they probably stay in this top 10. If not, again, they could end up getting jumped. Up next in the 9th spot, I have the only newcomer to this week's top 10 list from last week in the Vancouver Canucks, who stayed hot through this week, getting 2 important wins. Had they lost either one of them, it might have thrown it a little bit into question against more mediocre to bad teams, with the win over the Predators and then a convincing 5-0 win over the Blues, and then capped off the week with an overtime loss to the New York Rangers. But that's still a loss that almost reads as a at least moral victory to me. Certainly in a power rankings way, it's not something I can punish them for, as it came on the second half of a back-to-back, and again is against one of the best teams to this point in the season so far. Plus, again, with it being overtime, yeah, they still managed to get a point out of it. Even outside of the wins and losses, though, the way the Canucks are winning so far to this point in the season seems to be one that should give some hope, at least in Canuckland anyway, that it can be sustainable throughout the rest of the season, and this won't be just another one of these Canucks teams that finds a way to disappoint its fans throughout the course of the season, as they're getting their contributions largely from the places you would like to see it come from in the lineup. Elias Pettersson has a share of being one of the league's leaders in points per game. Quinn Hughes is helping the Hughes brothers taking over of the NHL. And even outside of the individual contributions, as a team, they've managed to climb their way into the top 5 in goals for per game, just under 4 per game, and are just outside of the top 5 at 6th in the league in goals against per game. Plus, they've got a power play that's top 10, which is not something they could say last year. And while the penalty kill is still towards the bottom of the league, it is a team that all in all has gotten off to a very good start to the season. And while again, as a Kraken fan, I wouldn't mind seeing them slowly fall apart a bit as the season goes along so the Kraken can hopefully climb their way back into a playoff spot, it seems like a Canucks team that might be here to stay, at least this year anyway. Then in the 8th spot, I've got the LA Kings, who had a relatively similar week to the Canucks with 2 wins against a mediocre opponent, both of them against the Arizona Coyotes, who actually have gotten off to a pretty decent start to the season themselves, so aren't the pushover of a Coyotes team that we saw last year, and then finish it up with a shootout loss against another one of the league's best in the Vegas Golden Knights. Now for the Kings, they are very much being carried by their offense as they top the league in goals for per game at 4.38, so safely in first place, which is a good thing because the goaltending has definitely exposed itself, as I think a lot of people expected, the weakness and Achilles heel of this team. It's towards the bottom of the league, and certainly the .877 save percentage is not something that's going to be particularly helpful as the season goes along, and certainly come playoff time if they are to make it there. All the same, it still is a Kings team that, while I don't know they'll be climbing their way into the top 5 at any point, seems like a safe bet to stay hovering around here towards the bottom of this top 10 list as the season goes along. Plus, as far as that scoring is concerned, unlike, say, the Red Wings, for example, who are kind of leaning pretty hard on just 2 players, the Kings are getting contributions pretty well up and down their lineup so far, and at least as far as that's concerned, it helps protect them from a couple of top players having cold streaks. And to be honest, if it wasn't for that suspect goaltending for the Kings, I'd be perfectly okay with moving them up at least to the 7th spot on this list, where at the moment I have the Dallas Stars. Now, part of the reason that I'd be okay with moving the Stars down is because I just don't really know the best place to put them, in part because of the smaller sample size, with them having played the fewest games in the NHL to this point, having played just 6. And only 2 this week, as they did fall from the 4th spot last week. I think I said that Detroit was in the 4th spot earlier. Detroit was actually 5th. I had the Stars 4th, but the Stars do get their first regulation loss against the Toronto Maple Leafs, but also pick up a 4-1 win over the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now for the Stars, even with having played fewer games than everybody else, they've gotten here in a pretty opposite way to what I just talked about with the Kings, as the offense for the Stars has yet to really show up to this point in the season. They did have the 4 goals against Pittsburgh, but again, just 1 against Toronto, and no matter how you look at it, with just 1 guy at a goal per game, and that doesn't include, well, that 1 guy is not Jason Robertson or Rope Hintz or Miro Heiskanen, all 3 of those with just 4 points in the 6 games, and Robertson just 1 goal in those 4 points. So the offense that we saw from the Stars last season definitely has yet to show up. We would have to expect that it probably will get going here at some point. And if that offense gets going while they're getting the goaltending that they are at the other end of the ice, this could be a pretty dangerous Stars team, as Ottinger has gotten off to a hot start to the season. He's one of the 2 or 3 best goaltenders in the NHL to this point. Whether you want to look at save percentage, goals against average, or goals saved above expected, Ottinger has gotten off to the start of the season that the Stars would have liked. They just haven't necessarily gotten the goal support for him that you maybe would have expected. Now, fortunately, by this time next week, we will have a little bit better of an idea where the Stars are at early on in the season, as they've got 4 games upcoming by this time Sunday night next week, with 3 easier opponents, or at least 3 opponents without great starts to the season, in Columbus and then both the Alberta teams, which both of them are going to look to turn around their season, and the Stars on the schedule might not be a good way to do that, but then they'll finish it off against the Canucks, so that should be a good test for both of those teams coming up on Saturday of next week. Up next in the 6th spot, I'm moving up 1 spot from last week, and I can even see an argument to maybe move them up another spot, but I'll stick with 6 for now. I've got the Toronto Maple Leafs, who, as they can do pretty free... Up next in the 6th spot, and moving up 1 spot from last week, and I could even see an argument to move them up another, but I'll stick with 6 for now. I've got the Toronto Maple Leafs, who continue to perplex when it comes to the teams they win and then lose against, as they do pick up 2 wins to start off the week, a win that you would kind of expect against the Capitals, who are not off to a great start, and then a 4-1 win over the Dallas Stars, so a pretty good win there, with the Stars also being in this top 10 and above Toronto last week. And then they go and lose in overtime to the Nashville Predators. So, again, it's a Leafs team that is often the case with them, is hard to exactly pinpoint how they're doing at any given time, but you kind of expect with the talent they have that they'll be somewhere in the top 10 and hovering around maybe that 5th spot at some point here. Now, maybe it's a little probably not concerning is a little bit strong, but after getting the back-to-back hat tricks to start the season, Austin Matthews only has 1 more goal, and the scoring has been kind of up and down for this team, and the defense has not been particularly good. Fortunately for them, while they haven't made it easy for him, Woll has been pretty good in net. Now, the save percentage and goals against average are just above league average in both cases for Woll, but again, the defense in front of him has not been making it easy, and when it comes to goals saved above expected, at least according to Money Puck anyway, Woll has been the best goaltender in the NHL to this point early on in the season. And since we know with the Maple Leafs that goaltending has been, over the last few years, one of the harder things for them to solve on a consistent basis, if Woll can be that guy in net for them, this is going to be a team that will not only have no trouble making the playoffs, they probably should make it there anyway without too much trouble, but could even potentially make it past 1 win in the second round, for the first time in a very, very long time. Now, obviously, it's still way too early in the season to be thinking that far ahead, and yeah, we have seen this kind of thing happen before with the Maple Leafs, where they have a goaltender that has a hot month or so. I mean, just look at Campbell a couple years ago, but at least it's a good start to the season and a promising sign for a team and a fan base that has been looking for that guy in net for, well, a while now. And then in the 5th spot, dropping all the way from number 2 last week, I've got the Colorado Avalanche, who would have dropped even farther if it wasn't for the strong start to the week with a 7-4 victory over the Islanders. So a pretty big win there, not necessarily because the Islanders are a powerhouse per se, but because it is a team that is notorious for not letting up a ton of goals, and the Avalanche did score 7 on them, but they also let up 4 against an Islanders team that's not necessarily known for scoring a ton either. And it was that side that showed up in their last 2 games of the week, where they got shut out 4-0 in both occasions to the Penguins and then the Buffalo Sabres, especially a Penguins team that, well, Jari is still really figuring out how to find the consistency, and yeah, back-to-back shutouts for an Avalanche team that was scoring 5, 6, 7 goals a game for a few games coming into that is a bit concerning. Now, I don't mean concerning in the sky is falling type of way by any means. This is not an Avalanche team that I expect to see being shut out that many more times throughout the course even of the rest of the season, but it does potentially expose some weaknesses in a team that otherwise through 6 games had not really shown any. Plus, it isn't necessarily a good sign, even if he's not expected to miss time at this point, that Makar did leave that game against the Sabres after a big hit from Okposo. Still, even with the back-to-back shutouts, the Avalanche are a just outside top 5, I think 6th place in goals for per game, so they still have a good buffer there, and I would expect them to get back to scoring some goals. And besides, at the other end of the ice, even after having given up 4 goals 3 games in a row, they're still 4th best in the NHL when it comes to goals against per game, and Georgiev, even after a little bit of a tougher week for him, is still one of the league's best goaltenders to this point in the season. So it's not a team that I would expect to be seeing too much of what we saw in these last 2 games to continue, which is why I'm keeping them just in 5th place for now and not dropping them farther. Up next in the 4th spot, I have the New Jersey Devils, who, very much like the Kings in the West, are riding their offense pretty hard early on in the season, and specifically the offense that they're getting from Jack Hughes, who leads the NHL with 13 assists to 5 goals for 18 points overall. And even Jesper Bratt, for that matter, has been doing pretty well with 6 goals and 8 assists of his own. But this is a team that has pretty much picked up where they've left off last year. Offensively, defense and goaltending, still a bit suspect. actually towards the bottom of the league in both cases. But as long as they can continue to outscore their problems, they're going to have a lot of success this season. Which I suppose at the very least, especially if you're a neutral observer and you like goal scoring, does make Devils games very entertaining to watch. And for that matter, they had 4 of them this week, winning 3 of them. Now, the loss to a reeling Capitals team 6-4 is not ideal, but again, 3 wins to just the 1 loss helps them move up here. And those wins, 5-2 over the Montreal Canadiens, who again are off to a pretty good start to their season, even outside of what people expected coming into the year. Then 5-4 over Buffalo and 4-3 over Minnesota. So yeah, at least 7 goals per game in all of those. If you like goal scoring, this is a team to watch. As we move on then from the 4th spot to the 3rd spot, kind of like what we had earlier when we went from the Kings to the Stars, we move from a team that's been doing a lot of goal scoring and winning that way to a team that's been definitely finding more success with preventing goal scoring, with the New York Rangers here in the 3rd spot. Now, the Rangers are, well, so far to this point in the season, kind of like the Stars, but scoring more. Now, they're just around pretty much dead average when it comes to goals for per game this season, but still, they're getting it from the places you'd like. Panarin continues to score goals. Lafreniere still has had a pretty good start to the season, not falling off from what we saw last week. And then in net, they're 2nd in the NHL when it comes to goals against per game, right around 2 allowed per game. Actually, sorry, exactly 2 goals per game, which especially in today's NHL with scoring on the rise, especially over the last couple of years, back to where it was in almost the Gretzky era, maybe not quite that much, but scoring definitely on the rise. If you can allow just 2 goals per game, that's definitely a recipe for success, and success even into the postseason. And for the Rangers, that definitely showed up this week, where they won their first 2 games, scoring just 3 goals in each of them. Now, it helped that they were playing the reeling, and I have used that word previous to this, but I truly mean reeling to this point in the season, Calgary Flames, who they beat 3-1, and then Edmonton Oilers, who they shut out 3-0. Of course, as I already mentioned with Vancouver, that's where they finished their week, winning that game in overtime 4-3, but still allowing just 4 goals in 3 games this week is, well, yeah, it's a pretty good week defensively. And one thing to watch for, especially when it comes to that goal prevention for the Rangers, and something that could mean good things for this team throughout the rest of the season, would be the strong start to the season of Jonathan Quick, who through 3 starts has been fantastic for the Rangers, going back to his first start against the Kraken. And if Quick can continue to be the good Jonathan Quick that we really haven't seen for the last couple of seasons, but if he can be this good or even part of this good of a 1B option for the Rangers and allow them to get Shesterkin a little bit more rest throughout the regular season, that could set up this team very well going into the playoffs. And finally, with the last 2 spots, I don't think I'm going to be surprising anybody with either one of these, not just the 2 teams I have here, but the order I have them in. Because obviously, as I reveal a second, you'll know by process of elimination who's in first. In second, I do have the Boston Bruins, who did also lose their first game of the season this week in overtime, but to the Anaheim Ducks, who, even if the Ducks aren't as bad as we thought so far, still not the team you really want to be losing your first game of the season to, even if it is in overtime, but it was also at home for the Bruins. Either way, they do manage to bookend or sandwich that loss between a couple of convincing wins, a 3-0 shutout of the Blackhawks, and then bounce back from that overtime loss to the Ducks with a convincing 4-1 win over the Red Wings. For the Bruins, they continue to be the best team in the league when it comes to preventing goals, letting up just 1.8 goals per game, and obviously in that way, just like I said last week, picking up where they left off last year, not just with picking up points in all 8 of their first 8 games of the season, because although they did lose, it was in overtime, so the point streak is still intact 8 games in, but they also continue to have the best goaltending tandem in the league. So again, for the Bruins, even though, just like has happened, it seems for the last few years, everyone doubted what they did in the offseason and that their core continues to get older, they continue to defy what everyone expects and continue to push what maybe will never be a fall off for this team farther and farther into the future, as somehow, even after setting a record for wins last season, they're on pace to do it again, even if it's early on and you would imagine they'd fall off at some point, at least a little. Which of course then does mean that I still have in first place the Vegas Golden Knights. Now I will say that it is closer this week between the Bruins and Golden Knights. Obviously, the Bruins moved up a spot with Colorado falling out, but even outside of that, well, the Golden Knights, like the Bruins, did lose their first game in overtime this week, and like the Bruins, it was to a team that isn't necessarily expected to be all that good, and it was at home, losing 4-3 to the Blackhawks. Also, like the Bruins, the Golden Knights did have on either side of that loss 2 wins, but those 2 wins were not as convincing as the Bruins' wins. They just edged out the Flyers, who also have had a good start to their season, 3-2, and then they won in shootout over the LA Kings. Now, of course, with that having been said, the Golden Knights still have played the one more game than the Bruins with the 8-0-1 record to the Bruins' 7-0-1, so a little bit farther into the season with that point streak. And I would still make the argument that the Golden Knights' strength of schedule has been a little bit harder than the Bruins, but we're kind of splitting hairs when it comes to that. Ultimately, the Golden Knights are not that far off of the Bruins in the strength of preventing goals, as they're third in the league, giving up 2.22 goals per game. And unlike the Bruins, they are a top 10 team when it comes to scoring, so a little bit more of a balanced attack than what we've seen from Boston so far. Either way, these two teams are clearly the 2 best in the NHL to this point, which I can say without any bias whatsoever. I mean, it's already pretty obvious by their record, but these are also my 2 least favorite teams in the league, so I'm not particularly happy about having to put them 1 and 2, but there's no doubting that these are the 2 best teams at this point. If for some reason you disagree with me though, feel free to let me know about that down in the comment section with really any part of this top 10 list. Who did I leave off it entirely? What team should maybe be higher or lower than where they are? I'd love to know your thoughts. And again, it's still early in the season, so a lot could change as the season goes along. There's definitely some teams well outside of this top 10 that I wouldn't necessarily be surprised to make an appearance as we get probably more into December with some of the starts that potentially playoff contending teams have had to the start to the season. Either way, it's just that crazy unpredictability of hockey and makes these power rankings fun to see what happens as time goes along. Anyway, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below to help support the channel and let me know that I should continue doing these power rankings as many weeks as I can. And if you'd like to support the channel a little bit more, there's also a Patreon link down there, especially for you Kraken fans. It offers some perks when it comes to the game reviews for the Kraken. Other than that, until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and please let those top 2 teams start losing.